experiences of, then they can't simply exist. And so from that, we also begin to see that come about in philosophy. It's absolutely true when we say religion and philosophy, especially Buddhism, does not require form. On the other hand, why that form became necessary comes about from the understanding is that as adept and potential, full of potential and quality this human mind may be, yet we have come to a point in our life where this mind has become stuck, with its own arrogance, stuck within its own realm of experience, that it can't move beyond self and the experiences of the self, such that even suffering has to be defined to us through texts, through philosophies. It is not that you and I do not know what suffering is, but at the same time, the designing and the layout and who we have become as a person, so very arrogant and egoistic and self-grasping in its own way, that suffering often is simply not fulfillment or the not being able to fulfill all our demands and expectations, and that is what we refer to as being suffering. And so therefore, the actual suffering of sentient beings not having been understood, we have no sympathy for sentient beings. And we look around and we see all the beautiful faces, and everyone's getting along just fine. Nobody really needs that much of suffering. Little bits and pieces of information that we see about the third world and the sufferings of sentient beings here and there. And as Buddhist meditators, probably one could say you meditate and try to understand what the sufferings of the sentient beings are. Nevertheless, the busyness of our own activities and the search for one's own entertainment in life, the busyness with which our body, speech, and mind is that we have no idea what suffering is about, and therefore the mind doesn't seem to have the urgency of developing loving kindness, doesn't see a problem, and therefore doesn't see the solution as being that very necessary, and the mind comes back into thinking, yes, I need to generate loving kindness, but there is still time. There is no one there who really needs the suffering. I don't know who I mean when sentient beings are being mentioned here. Therefore, let me go back to being the same person I am. And we come back to our own creation of karma. Actions, again, do not stop. And we keep saying the things. We generate limitless thoughts. We keep creating actions of the body. And we keep hoping. And we keep aspiring. Actions are continuously created. Fruitions, therefore, are established. We keep aspiring for loving kindness, and yet the mind never stirs to the point of knowing the urgency of developing genuine loving kindness. Therefore, a teacher comes about and says, visualize a nine-headed deity, and perhaps you will from there meet at some point. Do breathing, and perhaps with that you will come to a point of understanding. Do analytical meditation, and perhaps with that you will reach a point of understanding, and all kinds of techniques and methods evolve from that as a way of better enabling the mind to first gain one-pointed concentration, and from that deepening the understanding of genuinely generating loving kindness. And from that, Mahayana teachings talk about loving kindness. And if we look into some of the works of Shantideva, one of the great Mahayana teachers, as well as Jigme Lingpa is one of them who has explained the four immeasurable qualities in detail, talks about a simple thing. Sit in meditation, generate loving kindness, is explained in one sentence, followed by, if you can't, or if you don't know what loving kindness is, sit for a brief moment and think about a mother's love for her only child. And how much does a genuine one-pointed concentration of that mother in genuinely wishing happiness for her only child, that any prayer she would make or aspiration she would make it so that this child of hers, whom she loves very much, is very attached to, she would make so that this child has happiness. This child's life is fruitful. There is great benefit, long life, goodness, wealth, well-being, and happiness that this child attains. Similar to such an example, sit and first introduce your mind to seeing whom would it be to whom you could give that kind of a loving kindness to other sentient beings. So it's a simple thing that you could develop and sort of introduce one's own mind into saying, of all the limitless number of sentient beings, there has to be somebody whom you can bring into your mind as being the recipient of loving kindness from yourself without any expectations from this person, without the hope and the wish to gain something from it, a genuine, simple, loving kindness that could be generated to the others. That is the second step that is taught about. Thirdly, it talks about, now if one is not able to do this too, and one would come up with a question and say, what would a loving kindness heart actually feel like? Such a person, then within the text, especially Jigme Lingpa talks about is, then that person as a meditator could simply bring to mind whom you would think epitomizes loving kindness. Whether it is a saint, whether it is a bodhisattva, whether it is a teacher, whether it is the Buddha himself, or whether it may be one's own parents, mothers and fathers, whether it is one's own sons and daughters, or any great being that we know in this world. For us, most of us would easily visualize His Holiness the Dalai Lama. And try to look into the mind of that person, of that individual, of that being, of that bodhisattva, and try to see the impartial, genuine kindness that is there within the mind of that person. And for a brief moment, pause and allow your mind to mingle with the mind of this person who is the perfect example of loving kindness, and rest for a brief moment. And that is said to be a simple introduction into understanding what genuine loving kindness actually is, or introducing the mind to feel loving kindness without expectation, without any sense of return, favor, or any kind of giving back that one would expect from this individual. Pausing for a brief moment, whether it is brief to brief, 1 minute or 3 minutes or 5 minutes, whatever it may be, is beginning to first work with generating the first emotion or the first immeasurable quality of loving kindness. When that is then practiced, according to the Mahayana teachings, it talks about from that one is able to cut through self-attachment or desire, as we often say, but the cause of desire again being self-attachment. And so self-attachment, to sort of go out of it or to try to avoid self-attachment, to give up self-attachment, does not require a particular method of destruction of self-attachment or desire. Introducing the mind to its basic nature of being able to remain within genuine loving kindness, that itself becomes the antidote to self-attachment and gradually trains the mind to make more space of quietness, more space of openness within one's own self. And so from brief moments, gradually extending, now as a part of practice and meditation, extending to that into a longer duration of time, that is then one's own responsibility that needs to be done. Similarly, when it comes to the second immeasurable quality of hoping all sentient beings to be free from suffering and the cause of suffering, in simple words, generating compassion for all sentient beings, just as with the loving kindness, also here too, taking the same example and generating genuine compassion for all sentient beings. If one encounters the same difficulty of not knowing what compassion is, then again, the text, Mahayana text talks about is bringing to mind someone who is suffering, is in pain, whether it is an animal, whether it is a person you know, whether it is a person who has died, being able to become more aware of suffering and pain that you can actually see, and generating genuine compassion that is without any strategy, without any planning, but is completely being in-tuned in that moment of rawness, of complete genuine compassion, a sense of how can I best help at that moment. If silence helps, may I be silent, without strategy. If saying something helps, may I be able to learn to say something. If it is generating a prayer, may I be able to learn to generate a prayer, a much more spontaneous presence and awareness, availability at that moment, being able to learn and introduce the mind to what compassion is. And as the text would say, if there is a person, if there is a mother who has great love for a child, and that child was in terrible pain with sickness and almost dying, kind of single-pointed concentration that this mother would have in ways of finding whichever way it may be that could alleviate the suffering of or pain of her only child. At that moment, the mother doesn't have a planning. Mother doesn't say, let me sit down and breathe this way or breathe that way. Doesn't say, let me visualize in this way. doesn't think about what does it do to me? Am I doing it in a correct way? Am I doing it in a wrong way? Is this the Buddhistic way of doing things? Is this the non-Buddhist way of doing things? There are not so many mental chatters other than a directed, single-pointed concentration about being present at that moment in best ways how this person could be helped. Therefore, in the same way, training the mind to generate compassion would be introducing the mind to be available at any given moment such that it could be of help to any sentient being or any person at that moment. If needed, then meditating upon it or familiarizing and introducing your mind in becoming familiar with what compassion means. Compassion without strategy means by reflecting upon any being at that moment who is suffering. And so if you are driving across on the freeway and you see an animal that's been run over, take a brief moment in being able to reflect in meditation on the last moments of extreme fright and extreme fear and confusion that that animal goes through. Briefly pause and see, or take your mind to immerse with the chaos, confusion, fear, and absolute not knowing what is happening, the great expansiveness of fear that this being feels at that moment, pausing for a brief moment and allowing the mind to become a little bit in tune, a little bit aware of what suffering is, so that it goes into being able to understand the genuine, basic nature of compassion that is there. It's about familiarizing oneself with one's own intrinsic nature of loving kindness, of compassion. In that way, again, there is no method that is required or visualization or any form required to let go of anger, second root poison. And often we talk about, what can I do with my aggression? What can I do with my anger? And if you say it in that way, again, out of that requirement of references, one could again say, transform your anger into Amoga Siddhi, transfer your anger into Padmasambhava or this nine-headed deity, then allow the deity to arise in the sky, allow the deity to dissolve into the space. Yourself and the space is different and indifferent, and we can go back and forth into working with anger. You can also take on the analysis of looking at the nature of anger. Does anger have shape? Does anger have color? Does anger have arms and legs? And ultimately not being able to prove that anger has arms and legs or horns and tails. Therefore, some sense of emptiness of anger can be understood also. You can take that path. But on the other hand, from a Mahayana perspective, a way of saying is, should a mind and understand and introduce and familiarize itself with knowing compassion, a different technique of working with aggression and anger may not be required. Mind that is able to permeate and be much more understanding of sentient beings and beyond the masks of each sentient being, if one could pause a little while to look into each mind of each human being, each sentient being, one would not have that much difficulty in understanding compassion. Training oneself to not simply judge or form an opinion based on what the apparent perception is, but behind each mask, behind each person, behind each life and life's experiences, deepening oneself to go into the mind stream of another individual and seeing the restlessness, the confusion, the same want of happiness, and the same dislike for pain and suffering that is there in the minds of all sentient beings. You look at a little ant and you see the same busyness as that of a person in the airport, running from one place to the other. All of us, you're sitting there and my sitting here. What could be a greater mark of ignorance than this? Isn't it? If I look at you, I often, and it's again what we always studied with our teachers is, from the way I see, none of you have any problems. Really. Everyone looks beautiful, sure of what you are doing, absolute control of life, all intelligent people, capable, no problem at all. From where you are seated, you look at me and say, no problem. She doesn't have any problem. It seems to know what she's talking about or so, or whatever it may be. But generally, that's the way we go about, is we look at the perception and we say, no problem, no problem, no problem, no problem, no problem. No one needs my compassion. Let me go back to creating my karma. Isn't it? And so compassion is about going beyond the mask, going beyond and being able to look deep into, taking the time to look deeper into, beyond the lipstick, the shampoo, the cream, the skin, everything, the masks that we bring about, knowing and being able to spend each moment in looking at the mind and the confusion that is there. Good way is to look into the television. For example, sometimes when you go from the channel number 1 to 100 different cable stations that are there, and if you flick through each of the channels, you'll find the varied emotions. 84,000 emotions may be difficult to enumerate, but if you in 1 minute change from all these stations, you click, then you find the display of all the neuroses. Developing compassion is not so difficult then. Anger, aggression, desire, hatred, jealousy, anger, aggression, desire, hatred, jealousy, anger, aggression, desire. And so that's a dramatized version, but that's who we are as a person. Therefore, as you sit in meditation, whether into one's own self or into the others, being able to have sympathy, being able to have empathy into looking into the minds and the needs, and if there was a sound of all our cries, if there was the ability to sit for a brief moment and listen to the sound of our own needs, our own search for happiness, for peace, then that sound, if one were to be able to conceive of, generating compassion and truly wishing goodness on all sentient beings, that at this moment may all sentient beings be free from unhappiness and suffering, is not a difficult thing that can generate. And therefore, at that moment, there is no room for anger. And so the mind is able to better have the ability to go beyond the preoccupation that we begin to develop, just seeing the outward perceptions and not being able to look at the inner minds of the other sentient beings. Likewise, for the third aspiration, the third immeasurable quality of joyfulness, one of the most difficult things to meditate upon is the third immeasurable quality. In a way of aspiration, we say it very easily, may all sentient beings be never free or separate from the happiness devoid of suffering. And it is said to be the immeasurable quality of joyfulness. But if we look carefully into the Mahayana teachings, it is said to be one of the most challenging, one of the most difficult qualities to be developed. Joyfulness is referred to be knowing the good qualities in the others. And perhaps a more learned a person becomes in spiritual practice, less adept we become in seeing the accomplishments, and lesser even so of being happiness at the accomplishments of the others. In search of benefiting other sentient beings, we do not recognize the arrogance that we begin to develop, eventually assuming that the entire world's liberation is going to be dependent upon one's own self, never resting to sit down and thinking that we may be the ones who receive liberation from others, that we have to be just as graceful in receiving compassion and kindness from the others, just as much as we want to develop compassion and loving kindness to the others. Just as much grace and generosity there needs to be in extending our compassion towards the others, one has to be able to receive it just as beautifully. Therefore, generating joyfulness is learning to be happy, knowing the accomplishments and the goodness of the others. Being able to look beyond one's own self and see loving kindness in the minds of the others, and knowing how to gracefully receive it. Being able to look into the accomplishment of wisdom, accomplishment of the practices of the others, and generating genuine joyfulness. Not simply limiting one's happiness to knowing that I have been generous, that I have been able to practice well, that I have meditated well, that I am generating the intention to benefit all sentient beings, but also learning to sit down and look around and say, there are good qualities besides suffering. There are good things also within this samsara and samsaric experiences, and being able to genuinely accomplish happiness and joyfulness. And so as the Mahayana text says, if one has absolutely, again, difficulty in not knowing how to be happy for the other, perhaps you could then start off with counting the accomplishments of someone that you're not so jealous of. And so beginning with the Buddhas, it says, count the accomplishments of the Buddhas and be able to develop happiness in that the Buddha has achieved Buddhahood. Be able to reflect upon the accomplishments of the enlightened beings and the teachers and generate joyfulness and happiness. Say, simple words would be, well done. I'm very happy that there has been someone who accomplished enlightenment, rather than constantly saying, I am not enlightened. not today, not tomorrow, it wasn't yesterday, or seemingly just going around looking at all the negativities that are around and never being able to see the goodness and the good qualities. Part reason why generating genuine kindness towards the others is also because we so much highlight what is wrong and what is not happening, what good is not happening, and do not seem to concentrate as much in seeing goodness in the others and the accomplishments of the others. What that does is that eventually the arrogance and the ego is fed. And because the arrogance and the ego is fed, there will come about a time where jealousy will be the most difficult obstacle or emotion that we will ever encounter. Much worse than anger, much worse than desire. Jealousy, the subtle jealousy, the strife, and the competitiveness that is there, that will become difficulty. And therefore, when two retreatants sit and retreat, the difficulty is not about coffee and herb tea. It's not about who wakes up earlier or later. It's about the simple things, about who can accomplish better practice than the other. And so ultimately, there is this competition that we all have. Ultimately, jealousy is the very root cause that does not allow kindness, generosity, or compassion to be there. Ultimately, it is the ego grasping that arises in the form of this attitude of jealousy, this competitiveness, where if we are the one who are wise and giving loving kindness, then we are having a good meditation. But when we do not see that happening in others, or we see that it is happening in the others, and others are accomplishing that practice, often the mind can't accept that. And so among meditators, if we see, problem is not that there is too much desire or hatred or jealousy or whatever it is, thing is competition. Thing is about who gets to sit first, who does meditation longer, who can say the more profound things, who is closer to the teacher, who gets to say something, who gets to do something, who gets to handle it in a certain way. It's about very small things, who gets the yellow cushion versus the blue cushion versus the front row versus the second row. All things that then bring about basic tendency in the mind that points towards jealousy, strife, and competitiveness. And so what does that do is it does not allow loving kindness to be there. Jealousy allows the destruction of loving kindness, compassion, generosity. So in one way, if we take time to reflect upon the inability to genuinely be generous and selflessly kind, one of the reasons could be jealousy. And so therefore, the third sort of analysis that one can generate is said to be sitting in meditation or in any way, learning to rest or pause for a brief while and genuinely take time to generate joyfulness by reflecting and taking time to see the accomplishment, seeing the accomplishment of someone that you know, and possibly go one by one, person after person, people that you know, especially people that you have difficulty with, in trying to see as a person who really wishes loving kindness and compassion towards all sentient beings, how much an adeptness have one been able to develop in being able to see the goodness in the others. From simple things as if there is a person who gets to sleep more than the other, then being happy that this person has the possibility to sleep a little bit more, rather than coming out and saying, you are wasting your life. Life is impermanent. You should be meditating. All the while, it's not about teaching this person about impermanence. It's about how dare this person sleep more than I. Isn't it? So in that simple ways, an analogy that is used, but in simple ways, also training the mind to be able to really generate joyfulness. Fourth is said to be equanimity. Equanimity is said to be the antidote to ignorance and arrogance or self-grasping. But equanimity is, again, in a simple way of putting it, would be doing the same three practices of loving kindness, compassion, and joyfulness, but without any separation. Without separation of generating more loving kindness and compassion to the ones that you love very much, and still have difficulty extending it to all sentient beings, particularly to those that you do not like or have difficulty with. Equanimity is being able to rest in loving kindness that encompasses all sentient beings. Equanimity is about being able to generate compassion not only for those who are visibly suffering, but also able to encompass all sentient beings, those who have apparent suffering and those who have also learned the art of concealing that suffering in different masks, through different masks. and being able to go into the presence of ignorance and confusion, wanting of happiness and not wanting of unhappiness, and at the same time not being able to really gain the wisdom of knowing the difference in terms of creating causes that bring about suffering or creating good causes that generate happiness, and where each individual is ignorant of not knowing this, how one aspires one but does not get it, and that there is anxiousness, restlessness, hope and fear constantly, and to all those sentient beings without any discrimination, generating compassion. That is then resting in compassionate equanimity. Similarly, joyfulness again, not only extending to see the good qualities of those that you like and love, but training the mind to genuinely generate the same sense of awareness of accomplishments and goodness. The Buddha nature, the human nature, the basic goodness, just as much as is there within one's own self, is there in the minds of all sentient beings. And the respect and the genuine appreciation of all sentient beings being equal for all sentient beings. Need for happiness is the same. Freedom from suffering is wanted by all sentient beings. Peacefulness is aspired by all sentient beings, and therefore allowing the mind to rest within that knowledge and understanding that it is equal for all sentient beings, and within that non-discrimination, training the mind to remain within would be training in equanimity. When that is then understood, and the mind slowly introduces itself through the simple for immeasurables, the spontaneous destruction of all the negative qualities arises. And so if one is saying aggression, ignorance, arrogance, desire, attachment, and jealousy, these are the different emotions that are beginning to become difficult. There are methods that one can apply in destroying the negative defilements. On the other hand, simply increase what is your basic intrinsic nature as a human being and allow the basic sanity to generate that which is useful. And as we say, one is not dead, one will create actions. Physically, we create actions, we will continue to speak, we will continue to generate mental thoughts. And as long as karma is going to be created, simply transform that into something useful that is not particularly spiritual, something useful that which is the adornment of human nature. Instead of those negative qualities that nobody seems to want anyway, generate loving kindness, generate compassion, allow the mind to become a little bit more aware of the presence and the existence of other sentient beings, and be happy that they do exist, and be able to allow the mind to be non-discriminatory in knowing that just as much as I enjoy good weather and good food, may all sentient beings enjoy the same thing. Nothing very profound about it. You can say, may all they be liberated and great wisdom arise in the minds of the all sentient beings. You can say that too. But on the other hand, if you are going to sleep, may all sentient beings have the moment of sleeping in a good bed. May all sentient beings have the time to rest and enjoy the day. And in that way, beginning to simply train the mind that encompasses other sentient beings, gradually becomes then what is known as the fertile ground of becoming a mind that can be referred to as Bodhi mind or compassionate mind, whichever name you may give it. A symbol would be is a mind that can think good and being trained to think good. And so where that basis is arisen, then some amount of basic awareness, and that basic awareness bringing about the closer to one's own intrinsic awareness, basic sanity, that can be brought about. Within the Buddhist tradition, various methods of meditation are again for that purpose too. And so, if you are meditating, realize that this is what you are meditating for. Through your visualizations, recitations of mantras, shamatha vipassana practices, trekchö tögal meditations, no matter how much sky-gazing, clear blue sky you may be looking at, if the mind is not training itself to genuinely encompass love and compassion for all sentient beings, then simply sky-gazing is not going to bring about much benefit. You may be good at breathing in and breathing out and holding your breath for 21 hours and ohms and whatever you may be doing. That's also very good. But it's nothing better than aerobic exercises if that is not, again, transcending the mind to genuinely generate loving kindness and compassion. Therefore, as we say, you hold the nose this way or you hold the nose that way. Point is, you hold the nose. Whether through meditation, liking meditation and being a very devout spiritual practitioner, hold the nose. generate basic awareness of body, speech, and mind. If you are a skeptic against any form of practices, remain like that for your entire lifetime, but hold the nose. Generate awareness and basic awareness of one's own intrinsic nature. What you don't want, what you don't like, nobody wants. Therefore, don't do it. What we all aspire, what we all want, then make sure that you create ground for it, isn't it? And so, if it is not the sourness of the lemon that one wants, plant a mango seed, mango tree will grow. Same way, happiness, genuine goodness, freedom from suffering, basic awareness, primordial wisdom, and enlightenment. If that is what we achieve and want to achieve, then creating mindfulness of the body, speech, and mind, awareness that whatever you say, do, or think about is completely immersed within genuine kindness. That is essential. If it is kindness and genuine awareness that is being created, no whether one is meditating or not, result will always be cause of happiness and freedom from suffering. If one's own mind is not aware and developing genuine intrinsic kindness of body, speech, and mind, mindfulness of body, speech, and mind itself is lacking in, then no matter how much one visualizes and meditates, one is simply going to become a loyalist to that path of the practices. Genuine fruition will be very difficult. And so ending it again with one story about this Tibetan Buddhist meditator who had great hopes of attaining liberation, but really believed that liberation would drop down from the blue sky one day into his lap. And in that expectation spent his entire lifetime. And one day he decided he didn't have, of course, enlightenment doesn't drop down from the blue sky, so nothing much happened to him, so he decided to lie about it. And he ran to his teacher and he told him that the enlightenment dropped down from the blue sky into his lap, and he saw the face of Amitabha Buddha, the enlightened Buddha. And so as the story goes, we often say, what a silly person this person was. On the other hand, you and I are quite doing the same thing. We may not have become so literal about it as to expect it to fall from the blue sky, but we do think accidentally one day we will begin to generate genuine loving kindness towards all sentient beings. But what is essential to understand is loving kindness also, just as enlightenment doesn't drop down from the blue sky, loving kindness will not drop down accidentally, and so it will require us to work on it. Truly bringing about enlightenment or benefit to oneself and the others lies within the key instructions of generating mindfulness of body, speech, and mind. And so you can do that with all different kinds of techniques, or by simply knowing that you have the human mind that can watch what you are saying, watch what you are doing, and watch what you are thinking of. And the best is to keep it as simple as possible. If you don't like the simplicity, then we can go through the 84,000 tenets. Okay, so I think I better stop here. I'm assuming there might not be many questions, knowing that many of you probably already know the answers. But if there are some questions, yes, certainly we can do them. Joni Chadaro.
Hold it.
Thank you, Rinpoche. I was wondering where...
Joni, why don't you sit down?
Where does free will and karma intersect? Because if you have karmic tendencies in a certain inclination on the one hand, and then on the other hand there's this potential to generate good or bad, you know, in the simple way, say good or different qualities of karma. I'm always trying to understand where the aspect of free will.
Karma is there and we create, and karma is very powerful in that unknowingly or unintentionally we have become so very stuck with our own habitual patterns that karma is very easily accumulated. And so we don't have to very strongly emphasize or think about the actions that we do or say a speech that we make or the thoughts that we generate. It's very easy to do them, and therefore, no matter whether we've thought about it or not, recognized it or not, intentionally or unintentionally, cause is already created and therefore has the full potential of fruition. But the good quality of karma is that it is impermanent, it is changeable. And so human nature and the basic awareness of the mind, and therefore when we say develop awareness and mindfulness, whenever that awareness and mindfulness arises, free will is that it has the possibility of changing that moment's karma into friendliness or into something that is more constructive and conducive. From the relative aspect, it would be transforming anything negative into something that's really good and positive and constructive. From the absolute perspective would be also to liberate that moment's cause completely so that it no longer has the potential of further creation.
So the free will is actually
the prajna.
And that's dominant then ultimately.
Certainly it is dominant, of course. Yes.
The prajna is the same as the free will.
Yes. Mm-hmm. Yes.
Rinpoche, thank you very much for your wonderful talk. I wonder if you could address, I think that one of the reasons that people appear to be selfish is that, especially in this country, I think that we have a sense of futility. That is that we can't really make a difference. And I have come to see recently through practice that when I dedicate my practice for the benefit of beings, that it is actually a real and tangible result. And so I'm able to do this now in a very different way. But I think that it's very difficult for people when they dedicate. It's a very abstract thing. I was wondering if you could address this.
I think that's very true. One weak aspect of probably not going into other philosophies, but at least among the Buddhist meditators, is the lacking in the understanding of aspiration and merit, accumulation of merit, as we say. We tend to talk too much about the philosophical way of viewing what karma is and how karma does interact one another. So as I said earlier, what I say, what I do affects you, what you say, what you do affects me. We create this environment. So there is an individual karma that I create affects me individually. But an individual karma can also become a collective karma. And so collectively what we create affects me. What I create affects collectiveness of our own environment. And so if we look at it from that perspective, not only as cause and effect, but if we look at it also from good aspect of it. And so if there is a channel, a path of interaction between you and I, between myself and the entire world and this environment, based on that pathway, anything good that is accumulated also has an effect. An effect that may not be so apparent and dramatic as that which would fulfill my expectation of instant liberation, let's say, or instant freedom of all suffering. But if one were to see that subtle implications or subtle interactions between oneself and the sentient beings, if that is creating an environment, similarly, good actions, good aspirations, a simple thing as a good thought that is generated to the others has enough impact, also similar to a negative thought that might impact other sentient beings. So a pathway, the web of karma and interaction of karma that oneself has with the others is the road. And that road and the pathway, the web that is there, can be transformed positively also. And so that's the positive aspect of the karma. Part reason is also cultural in many ways. When Buddhism first came to the West, it came into a different culture, a culture that was dominant by various philosophies, particularly Catholic and Protestants. And so when the teachers first came and taught, one way is looking at is what we talked about, but the other way is also situations that arose. And many times, if we go back into 25, 30 years ago, and how Buddhism first originated, it originated and didn't come up in this country. It took people who already were part of that country and culture and religion to change from this thought pattern to this thought pattern. and worked against several issues. For example, even we remember earlier on when we could not use words, different words. Prayers was one of them. And many of the people who have stayed with Buddhism know about this, is that people will come up and say, Catholicism talks about prayers. How can a Buddhist talk about prayers? So the teachers never talked about prayers and talked more about view and emptiness and view and philosophy. It's only later on now the translators have begun to use the word aspirations. Similarly, in the Buddhist context also, sin, for example. And people would say, how come, if you're going to talk about sin, I'm not going to study Buddhism because this is not different from the Catholicism that I was coming from. And so people would come up with that. So teachers never used the word sin. Unvirtuous actions was what we used. It's only after the translations of Words of My Perfect Teacher that we've begun to say, hell realm exists, hell realm exists. But before that, we didn't say hell realm existed. So that was cultural influences within Buddhism also as it traveled to the West, that brought about things which didn't mean that we didn't have to talk about it. And that left certain aspects out, and merit being one of them, purification being one of them, aspects that are there that are related to, from a philosophical perspective. There's a difference in the way we look at purification, or in the way the Buddhist terminology or definition of what sins are, or how purifications and merits and prayers and aspirations arises. There's a certain difference in the definition. But nevertheless, it's also essential. One understands that just as if we say we are going to benefit all sentient beings, how are we going to benefit sentient beings? Is we are going to have to walk the path of karma. We are going to have to walk the same path as my aggression affects the others, my kindness can affect the others. If the thought of aggression can affect the others, thought of compassion can affect the others. And so what changes my thought are the mantras, the recitations, the prayers, the aspirations. So if a person, and you say, you begin by saying, may all sentient beings be liberated, may I liberate all sentient beings. And you're going to conclude that session saying, may this merit liberate all sentient beings. It has to take a very thick-skinned person with no embarrassment to have gone through these both preliminaries and dedications, and yet not to do them again, not to ever work on them again and again. So it's a hope, basically, we can say, of teachers thinking that if you do it enough times, you might one day wonder why I'm not actually doing it. And perhaps it might just click in at that moment. It's the same way of throwing yourself on the floor 100,000 times. That perhaps in that 100,000th of doing it, you would say, it's so easy to create a karma, so difficult to purify and be responsible for it. And it might just be that right moment, which might be the 99,000th time. One doesn't know. One only can hope and aspire. Yes?
I am having some confusion around actions that or karma that has both a wholesome aspect and an unwholesome aspect at the same time. And specifically, in our culture, at least in my life, I have to give a grade to students, and I'm having a difficult time with low grades because it causes a lot of suffering, in their families or with the student, and at the same time there's supposed to be a benefit and of integrity, and this is what you earn, this kind of thing. So, and I imagine that there's many actions that can have both an unwholesome effect and a wholesome effect. And so, we go about accumulating karma.
I think, therefore, actions play a secondary role to intentions. It is the intentions that is the most essential thing. If the intention is totally free of any profit-making, and it is totally based upon what good that would bring about to the others, a negative action could be a very virtuous action, could be a good action. From the Buddhistic perspective, there are no actions that can be designated good and bad. There are many actions we can say generosity is good, aggression is bad. We can simplify that and say it in that way. But if you were to look at the intention, an aggression could be a kindness, whereas tolerance could be selfishness, for example. So it is the intention. What do you teach? You should be very, very strict with your... Wrong calculations can lead to a lot of trouble. Yeah, when I studied, I had one of the worst math teachers ever possible who never liked passing anyone. So we all failed in mathematics. My entire lifetime I failed in mathematics. But it was very helpful. See, I'm learning the American way. Okay, I think we should stop now. Right? So, good night, everyone.